Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbox Brewing. My name is Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Today, as the calendar has flipped to June, we're going to be talking about the upcoming offseason for the Houston Rockets. It's going to be very crucial to the long-term health of this franchise. They get another top 5 draft pick. They have a league leading figure of about $60 million in salary cap room, which they could even add to if they see the need. And guess what? Now we are in the actual month where a lot of this is going to go down. The draft on Thursday, the 22nd, and of course, the opening of free agency negotiations on June 30th. So to talk about many of these dynamics, I'm joined by my good friend, co-host and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. Paulo, is there any more nerves now that you're actually in draft month and free agency month for that matter?
Yes, there's always more nerves. Which, I mean, I'm more, I guess we all know how I feel about the Scoot Anderson debate. I think the fact that it finally officially came out that he's not going to work out with the Rockets can be looked at as both not a bad thing, but kind of a negative from the sense that I would say that there would be a small chance that if he worked out for the Rockets, maybe he wows everyone, right? And it makes them trade up from my perspective of someone who wants good. But at the same time, if you believe in conspiracies or whatever, Jabari also didn't work out with us, and that's the guy who was supposed to go number 1 and then fell to 3. And we took him anyways, which proves that that's not a deal breaker for us, the Rockets, of course. But at the same time, if you believe in the conspiracy theory things, then maybe it's a repeat of last year where the guy that was supposed to go number 2 falls to the pick where the Rockets are. So I'm nervous. I'm it's not really nervous. It's more of an anxiety because so much is going to be defined by what happens in the draft. And I'm also I've grown increasingly nervous about us trading out of 20 because now I've looked further into it and there's some guys there that I
Chet
like.
Chet Howard's your boy now.
Yeah, I mean, I know people get triggered by this and by the fact that it is a factor to me that he is a massive Rockets fan, like a huge. This is not just the guy that follows Rockets. I think he's a huge Rockets fan. He's a massive Harden fan, which is crazy because and go on a little bit of a tangent real quick. I looked into it, right, and his dad played in Houston for 3 years only, so it's not like he was a Rockets lifer, right? His father, window. Yeah, his father is Juwan Howard, for those who don't know, and this was when he was 2 years old through to 4 years old. So he wasn't really in a position where, your sports team is not defined on your 2 through 4 year old window.
Right.
And after that, that played for like 6 more years, although some of them were like bench warmer, vet type of roles. But he played for like 6 more teams after that. He was a journeyman from that point forward. And he still stuck with the Rockets, even though his dad played for a number of different teams until he was 10, when I would guess by 10 you've kind of chosen your sports franchise, at least I already had.
Right.
So it's not like it's just, his dad played here, so of course he's a Rockets fan. No, he had plenty of opportunity to be something else, and he is actually a really big Rockets fan. At least for me, and I know some of the guys that do this, perhaps at a higher level, like the guys at The Athletic and stuff like that, they kind of separate their fandom from their analysis. I'm kind of a little bit in the middle where, yes, I do like to provide analysis, and then if you ask me, I can provide you something more unbiased. But I do, in my take, sometimes let the fan side out of me influence a little bit, and I am a sucker for narratives, and I am a sucker for these stories, and it would be just such a great story that a guy that is a massive Rockets fan, which is rare amongst draft prospects, he's one of the few like that I've heard of, right? And now his window where he is draft eligible coincides perfectly with the window where the Rockets are trying to, rebuild, and they're going to be looking at guys like him to draft. I think it's a really cool
And
coincidence.
he fits a need. They need shooting.
Yeah, he does. I mean, he's a 6'8" shooting guard that is a sharpshooter. I mean, I, I I don't know how that doesn't sound appealing to anybody. I think he is a poor defender, and I don't think it's tools, because I think the tools he has, all of them. I think it's an IQ and a commitment, that type of thing. But I don't know. I think at 20, if he turns out to be a 6'8" shooter that improves a little bit on his defense, that's a pretty good outcome. And come on, man, I'm a sucker for these things. So if we
Yeah.
get him at 20, I'll be pretty happy.
Yeah. And we should have some more intel on that front over the next few days. To peel back the curtain, we're recording this on Sunday night, June 4th. Actually, where Paulo is in Portugal, it's early Monday morning, June 5th, which means we're actually within 2 weeks of draft week. 2 weeks from right now will be the start of the draft week, which of course culminates on Thursday, June 22nd, when the draft actually takes place in Brooklyn. So I do suspect that you're going to hear a lot more concrete intel about what teams are looking at, what prospects have really made an impact with them with regards to the later first round pick. I think it was pretty clear by the middle of June last year that Tari Eason was definitely in play for the Rockets, and he ended up being the guy at number 17. So perhaps we'll hear a bit more about Chet Howard or some of these guys conceivably in play at number 20 starting this week. The bottom line is we're getting close. And so once you start to get inside of 2 weeks, which we're rapidly approaching, then a lot of the speculation is going to turn into more concrete reporting and legitimate intel. And so for people who want more of those discussions, I know we led off with a bit of a tangent on Chet Howard, but stay tuned. We're not avoiding those discussions for much longer. It's just we're trying to get a bit more concrete intel about who the possibilities are for the Rockets. Should mention, by the way, with Chet Howard, it's not totally out of left field. It was reported by Kelly Iko of The Athletic last week that the Rockets worked him out. The Rockets are typically one of the teams that has a really firm hold on their workout list. A lot of teams, like Portland, for example, they actually have video of when guys come in, even the top of the line guys like Scoot Henderson and Amin Thompson. They show and tell the world who they're drafting. For whatever reason, the Rockets don't. They don't. Not only do they not do video, they don't even do like a list of names or leak for the most part to sources who they've worked out. They try and keep everything in house.
You have to chase their Instagram pages and see the stories, see who's in
Right.
Houston.
Right. But hopefully, at least to a small extent, that stuff will change over the next couple of weeks, because as we get closer to the draft, again, agents are going to talk and they're going to want to try and find out what teams are legitimately in play for their clients. And so I think there's a chance that even if the Rockets don't come out and say it themselves, we should get more intel. And so we'll talk about that a lot more. We've had a couple of episodes, our last two actually, in which we had Nathan Fogg on and Brian Kalbrowski of USA Today Sports Media Group with some initial post-draft lottery insight on what the Rockets might do at number 4 overall and number 20 in the first round. But we'll pick up on that and then some over the next couple of weeks as we get more concrete reporting about what the Rockets and other teams around the NBA may be looking to do, not just in the draft, but perhaps heading into free agency as well, in terms of when the window opens for negotiations on June 30th. Are the Rockets going to be knocking on James Harden's door at that point? Will Rafael Stone have an iPad ready for him the way Daryl Morey did for Chris Bosh? Actually, Paolo, that was before your fandom. Have you heard about Daryl Morey and the Chris Bosh iPad?
I have not. The only free agency story that I know of before I was a fan
Yeah.
was the Kent
Okay.
Bazemore one.
So you want to talk about being down bad. So in the 2009 through 2011 window, pre-Harden, this was when the Rockets weren't allowed by their former owner, Les Alexander, to tank. So they just, Gerald constantly had this roster churn, trying to turn a nickel into a dime into a quarter, and so on and so forth. They did have maximum salary cap room, but the difficulty was, of course, in convincing a guy that Houston was the right fit for him. And in 2010, they went after Chris Bosh. Of course, Chris Bosh ended up signing with the Miami Heat to join LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, forming the big three there that went on to win 2 championships. But the first night of free agency, Daryl Morey and whatever team he had from the Rockets was on Chris Bosh's doorstep with an iPad. The iPad is a gift, and it had like a Rockets playbook and all sorts of stuff on it. Keep in mind, it's 2010, so the technology is not exactly the same as it is today. The year before that, in 2009, Marcin Gortat was a free agent. Do you know who Gortat is? I'm not sure if that
Yeah,
predates you.
I do.
Yeah, defensive-minded big man. And Daryl created a Gmail address. Rockets fans love Gortat at gmail.com, where he encouraged fans to email in why they wanted Gortat to join the Rockets. And then he printed off the emails and showed them to Gortat in the pitch meeting. So yeah, so we've come a long way. Those were dire days. Thank God, Daryl, and some of it's not his fault. Again, some of it's like the easiest way, the post Tracy McGrady and Yao Ming era would have been to bottom out and get high draft picks the way they've done the last 3 years. Les Alexander was not willing to tank. So his hands were sort of tied. And they had cap room, but it was tough to really make Houston that appealing because it was just a mediocrity treadmill situation. And even with that, his hands were tied. Daryl eventually bailed himself out by getting James Harden. And then once they got James Harden, they were desirable enough to get Dwight Howard in free agency the next summer, and the rest is history. But before then, man, the Rockets were down bad. Bringing an iPad to Chris Bosh, and Rockets fans love Gortat at gmail.com. Those were the days. Thankfully, I think the Rockets, even coming off a 22-60 campaign, are in a better leverage spot this summer, although we'll see what Rafael Stone does and if he has anything in mind for June 30th when negotiations can officially open. Of course, unofficially, we know good and well there's discussions going around the entire NBA with free agents to be in June. None of this really starts on June 30th, but June 30th is at least when you can send the
So
cavalry. You can.
so you're telling me that all of those deals that are made in 1 second aren't agreed upon just
I
one
know,
second prior.
shocking, right?
Unreal.
I will say in modern Rockets history, and this encompasses your fandom, in 2019, the entire month of June, when there were all these leaks about the Rockets feeling good about Jimmy Butler, having deals lined up to either, facilitate a sign and trade with the Sixers or move Eric Gordon and or Clint Capella into cap space. And then within 2 hours of free agency opening, Butler having a deal with the Heat. That was the ultimate gut punch. It's like, dude, really? Why the hell are we talking about this? But again, like for some perspective, that's why I think the Harden pursuit is a little bit different. The Harden pursuit, intel from everywhere is connecting James with the Rockets. Back then, it was like all the reports out of Houston were connecting the Rockets to Jimmy Butler and confidence they could get him. But nationally, there was a lot more talk about Butler in Miami. There's the infamous "Hey Big Head" tweet that I think Butler sent at Dwayne Wade a night before free agency opened. And ultimately, or maybe it was the reverse that Wade sent to Butler. I can't remember. But the point was, nationally, the connections were much more Wade to or Butler to Miami. And it was a bit more wishful thinking about Butler going to the Rockets from Houston sources. With James Harden, it seems to be much more widespread. And of course, we can talk about whether that's good or bad. We've done that in recent shows. I'm sure we'll do it in upcoming shows. The point is, the smoke seems to be a lot more widespread and real there. And we'll get into that. Again, this should be a busy month for us here at the Logger Line. We'll have plenty of coverage of the draft and free agency. A lot of our shows this time of year are based on speculation and reports because there isn't much concrete intel until the draft or free agency actually happen. I want this episode to be a little bit different because this is a rare circumstance in the offseason where we do have some confirmed on the record information courtesy of the Rockets community event this past Friday at the Freedmanstown Association in Houston's historic Fourth Ward, where they went out and had a community service day as an organization, but they also had people from up and down the chain, ranging from just your run-of-the-mill staffers at Toyota Center to coaches and executives and players. And so GM Rafael Stone, head coach Ime Udoka, and Jabari Smith Jr. and Kevin Porter Jr. as players all took part in the event and were made available to the media. And of course, for the Rockets, it serves multiple goals by making them available to the media. There's more media that are willing to come out. And so it shines a brighter light on their community service work, which is exemplary. But it also allows them to, I guess, A, give us some intel about their considerations heading into this crucial month that we've been outlining. And B, it potentially allows them to control the narrative a little bit in a period on the NBA calendar where so much, especially in our modern social media climate, takes on a life of its own from us trying to parse together various reports from sources and things that are out there that may or may not be true, but in the absence of real information, they can take on a life of their own and they can be good or bad for an organization. The last couple of years, it's been more of the bad for the Rockets in their rebuild, which makes sense. So for today's show, I want to talk about what we learned on Friday because I thought there really were some interesting takeaways from those media availabilities. And the first thing I want to hit home, and I want to get your perspective as a fan on Paolo, because I know you're very actively involved in Rockets Twitter, where folks can follow you at Paolo Alves NBA. Me, of course, I'm on there simply at Ben Dubose. I think it was a really good step for the Rockets to make Rafael available, because to me, the biggest takeaway was a very simple four-word answer when I asked him, was there any overlap or connection between the draft and free agency? There's been a number of reports lately that because the Rockets feel like James Harden may be coming in, that they could draft someone like Cam Whitmore, who's more of a wing, that would be more plug and play than a point guard like Amin Thompson or Scoot Henderson, since there's some positional overlap with James Harden. Now, I've said on this podcast before that I've been told by the Rockets emphatically that that's not going to happen. And of course, it makes sense with Harden being 34 years old and the player you bring in being 19 or 20 and a much more important asset long term. We talk about eventually when the Rockets a few years from now are trying to win a title. Of course, you shouldn't let a 34-year-old Harden weigh that heavily, if at all, on your decision making. But regardless, it's been out there from a number of sources. And even if they're just saying rival executives think, at some point, the totality of the narrative can become overwhelming in a point of the NBA calendar in which there isn't much of an opportunity for teams to actually push back. It's not like the regular season where you talk to at least coaches and players on a regular basis. You can get them on the record to address things. So in this case, I was just relieved that Rafael said, no, it's best available, referring to the draft and free agency and taking who they see, assuming it's a fit with, of course, what Ime Udoka wants to do as head coach. He mentioned that as well, and we'll get into that. But the Rockets are thinking about the long-term value of each asset. It's not about the short-term fit for a rebuilding situation that, even if they get James Harden, is not going to go into anything close to title contention mode in the near future. And so I sort of understand why the Rockets the last couple of years, like during this season, and we should mention that while coaches and players are available during the season, general managers generally aren't. And so this past year, you had a couple of narratives, especially in January and February, when things started really going off the rails for the team. And you heard some talk about, is Stone too heavy-handed in micromanaging his coaches and some of the practices? You had the John Wall tanking interview, and there really wasn't much of a pushback. In fact, it was Stephen Silas who was left to push back on the Wall interview. There wasn't much of a response from the front office or ownership. I'm sort of sympathetic as to why, because again, if you believe that you didn't have the right coach in place and you were going to make the change after the season, which they did, then maybe you don't think it's worth it to throw your head coach under the bus and say a lot of these issues are because we don't really trust the coaching staff and we need to make a change, because again, it's just a very difficult environment for your young players to develop in. And for reasons we've discussed in the past, they didn't want to go the interim route because they were clearly going to go after a big name like Ime Udoka in the offseason. They were just trying to get there. So perhaps in the past, it was beneficial to just keep your mouth shut, even if you had to take it on the chin with regards to some of the narratives that are out there. But in general, I do think it's useful to be able to push back. It's not so much that Rafael saying, no, they're going best available means case closed. The Rockets are for sure not going to weigh Harden in with their draft pick. No, this is just one side of the story. And they could be, trying to frame it to their benefit. I'm well aware of that. But at least what this does is make it clear that the reports that are out there, that's one side of the story. The Rockets have a different side of the story. And that makes people a lot more willing, in my opinion, to be patient and to let the process play out. And so it gives them a benefit of the doubt in a month that, look, in the past, maybe perception wasn't that big of a deal because it's during the season. Everybody knows they're going to let Stephen Silas go in the offseason, and then you can sort of reset the franchise anyway from a perception standpoint and credibility around the league, those angles. Right now, this is a big month. Behind closed doors, conversations are absolutely happening with agents and players around the league, targets you could go after in free agency. So this is a month where you don't want people around the league to wonder, hey, does Houston know what the hell they're doing? Do they have control? Is this a good situation that you can trust to build a contender over the coming years? So in my opinion, it's not so much that Rafael Stone saying that makes it case closed. The Rockets are for sure going to take best player available, not factor in Harden, but it does make it clear that they are pushing back. And so because of that, I think people are much more willing to keep an open mind and be patient heading into the draft, as opposed to if you say nothing, that it becomes a lot easier for those narratives to take hold. The example that I'll throw out there, people often say, especially those that aren't really on social media that much, that these narratives don't really matter. Look at Wemby on lottery night. I do think there was something extra with that viral video of him fist pumping and smiling when the Rockets went at number 4. Even if he wanted to go to the Spurs with all their French lineage, Tony Parker, Boris Diaw, I do think that's where he wanted to go. There did seem to be something extra when he knew he wasn't going to the Rockets, even relative to other rebuilding teams like Detroit, like Portland, like Charlotte. There was something extra. And my suspicion, Paolo, I think what limited American media NBA exposure that he's had, especially the final days leading up to the draft lottery, who was he embedded with? ESPN's Brian Windhorst and Jonathan Givony, who have not had very kind things to say about the Rockets the last couple of years. Now, I think a lot of their comments have been unfair. I think some of them are misguided. But what I think doesn't matter. Those are very powerful people. And if those narratives are taking hold, it can have a detrimental effect to the point where, yeah, it does look a little bit embarrassing when, the best prospect of the generation clearly did not want to play for you and was relieved when you didn't get the one pick. Again, I don't think necessarily the Rockets did anything wrong. I think some of it is circumstantial, but I do think that it's reflective, at least in part, of the power of these narratives. And so, again, I sort of understand why the Rockets didn't actively push back in the past, because people would just say, well, you're terrible. The product on the floor speaks for itself. And if the coach is the problem, then why is he here? And it's sort of a no-win situation. But now that you do know what you're doing, you're aggressively trying to win, you have a proven head coach that you trusted, Ime Udoka, then in my opinion, it is more important from a front office standpoint. We've talked in the past about making Rafael more available to sort of deal with these things hands-on. I think this was a good first step to that. It's not that I'm putting 100% stock in it and saying, hey, case closed, he said this, so this is the way it's going to be. No, I'm not saying that, but I do think that going forward, it's a good idea to have Rafael more available. And whereas in the past, there was the incentive to sort of just stay quiet and take the lumps because it's part of tanking and you're going to be bad no matter what. So just grin and bear it. Well, now that you're trying to win as part of this transition, then yeah, you can start to sort of counter those narratives a bit more. And so that's what, Rafael aggressively pushing back, at least to an extent, it represented that to me. Did you have a similar response?
Yes and no. So I think it is important that he's making himself more available. I'm just not sure if this availability in specific was him making himself more available than usual. I will say he was a little bit more objective and more transparent with his answers compared to when something similar happened last year, which I think it was a food bank or of some sort, if I can remember the clip correctly. I'm don't
Yeah.
quote me on that. So I think the fact that the media availability existed is something that I think was planned and that already happened
Well,
last year. So I don't think it's
yeah.
a change in approach.
I mean, the
But
nature of the responses. Yeah.
yeah. But the way he approached the answers was different, and it's been different ever since the Ime Udoka press conference. And this ties into something else that I wanted to say, which is I think that having Ime Udoka on the mic versus Stephen Salas, who are two completely different approaches to just communication with the outside, and they're two completely different levels of credibility from their past head coaching experience, will help with that as well. I think Stephen Salas was just complete chaos on the mic. He would say things that didn't make any sense at all. You'd question how did this guy get here with some of his answers. And I think Udoka is much more bold and more, in control, and just brings more credibility, at least so far, in what I've heard from him. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is The Cam Whitmore or the drafting for fit
Mhm.
answer was very, very clear cut. As I said, I don't think that in reality it's as clear cut as that. I think as much as we on Twitter and we as fans and analysts want to be 100% idealistic and say, free agency cannot impact um, what you're doing in the draft, and that in theory sounds good, and I agree with it. I think in reality, when you have a lot of options on the table and you're looking at the entire puzzle, it's something that I think also happens in discussion also in social media, which is we look at each decision in a vacuum without knowing what's going to happen next as to where a lot of the I'm sure Stone and his team is looking at a lot of decisions in a row that they know they can pull the trigger on. And when you're looking at a complete team, the complete building of a team, when it comes to free agency draft, and then the other, like, it's not just the decisions are not just who you're going to draft for and are you bringing James Harden or not, which is what it boils down to a lot on social media. The decisions are, okay, who are you going to bring in at 4, what's happening with 20, what's happening with Garuba, Josh Christopher, Tata Washington, etc. What are the trades, the consolidation trades that you have available for you around the margins? What are you going to do with a little bit of extra cap space after Harden? What are you going to do with the rule mid-level exception after you bring in Harden? If you do, there's a lot of dominoes that are going to fall. And I think in their, war room, there are probably a lot of different scenarios that have a lot of intertwined decisions that make it so James Harden coming in or not may have a little bit of an impact with what happens to 4, but it's not just if James Harden comes in or not. It's that if you bring in James Harden, there's a lot of subsequent decisions that are going to
Mhm.
happen that may bring more or less value. Does bringing James Harden in make it so you can get a better free agent with your room MLE? Does bringing James Harden in mean that you can, make a trade for a certain player that otherwise wouldn't really make sense
Mm.
for whatever reason? I think idealistically, trying to separate those two is good, and I agree with. I think in reality, I don't think they're completely intertwined, but I think there is a little bit of overlap in the
Fair.
decision making. That being said, I think it's still important for him to come out and say it,
Yeah.
because not saying anything makes it so social media and the media in general can go in whichever decision that they want to go.
Right. Exactly.
And
Which is what's happened in the past with the culture arguments and so on and so forth.
yeah, and even though his word's not, gospel, at the same time he is the GM, right? And his words are going to, from a common casual NBA fan going up to people that pay more attention, his word, truth or not, is going to hold a lot more weight
Yeah,
than whatever social media theory is
for
out
sure.
there. And if his word's not out there, then the next best thing is the social media
I mean,
theory that people are going to run with.
and to your point on it being situational, we should also point out so his last two availabilities, he's not really available during the season except for marquee events, like if they make a trade. He did talk after moving Eric Gordon at the deadline this year. But at the end of the season, it was after letting Steven Silas go. And of course, all the big picture, or at least most of them, discussions at that point were sort of tabled because they needed to hire the coach first. So everything was about getting the coach in place. And then after you have the right coach, we'll talk more about how the draft is going to play out, how free agency fits into it, because of course you don't want to do anything that's out of alignment with the coach you bring in and what he believes in doing philosophically. So everything at that availability, or 90% of it, was about the coach. And then the next availability, a couple of weeks later, when they actually hired Udoka and Tillman Fertitta was a late addition to the press conference, look, you had those three guys on the table with Stone, Fertitta, and Udoka. But even as someone that was in that building as a media member, I wanted to ask Rafael questions, but I couldn't really justify it because, of course, there's a limited amount of time. There's only so many questions each of us can ask. And Udoka and Tillman are way bigger priorities because Tillman's only available once or twice a year. If he's available, there's certain things you have to ask from an ownership perspective. And then with Ime, of course, he's the new coach. He is the headliner, and it's also his first availability since the scandal in Boston. And so we was talking about that. So even though Rafael was available in that late April press conference, he basically just sat off to the side and said nothing. And so it almost felt like a waste, you know what I mean? And that he's on the stage and there's all this stuff that you want to ask him, but you can't really justify asking that when there's obviously higher priorities at that time for Udoka and Fertitta. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it kind of like I think people love to complain about what the local media does, but at the end of the day, you guys are in a position to ask the questions, but you're not going to go. It's the same thing as you're not going to go into a post game presser and ask Stephen Salas about, I don't know, Erik Gordon getting traded, because that has nothing to. That's not what the point of
Right.
the presser is. But there's one more point that I wanted to hit on about why the draft and free agency need to be independent, and the idealistic approach that Twitter has. I think in this idealistic world, sometimes people say they should be independent of each other, but I actually think that the draft should be dependent. Not the draft. The free agency should be dependent on the draft. Yes, free agency happens after the draft, and you look at the calendar, and that's how it looks. But when you look at it from a realistic standpoint, most of these deals are being talked about weeks in
For sure.
advance, and the difference between the draft and free agency is just a week, I think, or maybe even less than that.
By the
And
way,
so,
before you go into that, there's been some discussion about the NBA potentially moving the draft after free agency, the way, or at least the first wave of free agency, the way the NFL does. Would you be in support of that, given that dynamic?
I would not
Okay,
at all.
you want the draft first,
Yes, because I think that's a I think it doesn't work the
even
same
though
as the
some of the
NFL.
discussions. Okay,
It doesn't work the same as the NFL because maybe it would change the dynamic and it would start working like the NFL. But right now, NBA free agency does not work like the NFL, where you have guys take, and the MLB as well. Guys take their time with their decisions in free agency. In the NBA, the first 3 days, everything's defined. And then
yeah,
there's a couple of guys that get left over for later on. But for the most part, it's a rush to grab all the money that's available from teams, and then the
yeah,
guys that don't move quickly will end up in a minimum deal just to stay in the league.
yeah. Fair enough. I just wanted to ask because it's so awkward. As you mentioned, there's 100% conversations going on all around the league between teams and free agents and their agency representation right now. And so, in theory, that's part of the incentive to consider moving the draft in the calendar, but it's not a foolproof solution. It's just something that I've seen tossed out because people are sort of annoyed by the fact that, hey, we know all these conversations are happening, even though they're not legal. It's just the league can't do anything about it.
But I don't even think that's going to change that much. I think what's going to happen because of that, and since the free agency in the NBA is such a rush, or a race against the time, I think what's going to happen is teams are going to make decisions, are going to prioritize free agency and make the decisions before the draft, and then there's going to be clashes when the draft actually happens. I don't think it's going to change. I think even if free agency started before the draft, you would still have conversations happening before the start of moratorium. So it's not going to change
Fair,
much. It
fair.
might diminish it a little bit, but I don't think it's going to change much. And the last point I wanted to make about what Stone said on the availability is, I was happy to know, or to have it confirmed, that free agency decision and everything, trades and everything, are going to be ran by Ime Udoka to kind of vet what they're trying to do. Because what you don't want happening, especially now that they're going to move into more of a focus on winning, is you don't want to happen what happened with Steven Silas, where they were drafting best player available, but Silas didn't know what to do with these players. I mean, Silas clearly did not know what to do with Alperen Sengun. And so you
Yeah.
don't want that disconnect between your coaching staff and your front office, where they're bringing in good players, but then they don't fit into what your coaching staff is trying to do, which is not a bad thing when you're rebuilding, because when you're rebuilding, the front office is completely separate, and they have, they should have independence and bring in the best talent available, and the coaching staff should be able to adapt to that. But then, since our coaching staff wasn't able to adapt to that, it's really kind of stopped making sense, why some of the decisions were being taken. But it makes me more confident. Not that I don't trust Stone, but I like kind of the philosophy that Udoka had in Boston, with the switchability, with the versatility in defensive schemes, with the prioritization of spacing, which Silas just didn't have at all. And so I like that Udoka is playing a big role in that, and I like that this is now a partnership. and that we're not going to see that disconnect between the
Yeah.
coaching staff and front office and the players they're trying to bring in.
Yeah, and again, I think that's why a lot of the narratives spun out of control in the past is that there wasn't that alignment. The answer to a lot of the questions that were out there about the culture and the day-to-day environment and development was that the front office did not really trust the coaching staff. They weren't bought in on the same vision, but for a lot of reasons, they didn't want to go the interim route. That wasn't going to be much of a solution at all in the grand scheme. And if they tried to actively answer some of the questions that were out there, it would come across that they were throwing their head coach under the bus, even though they weren't wanting to fire him at that time. It was just a no-win situation. So they just sort of kept their mouth shut. Whereas now that there is alignment, you can be a bit more transparent because there should be that trust. There should be the confidence that the vision of the front office is being reflected in the coaching staff and vice versa, as you were saying. So I think the idea is that now you can start to be a lot more transparent, a lot more open, because there is that alignment. You're not trying to sort of hide or protect, which I think was a big factor this past season, that they knew there was this hard decision that was going to have to be made, this parting of ways with the head coach and most of the staff after the year. They weren't willing to do it at that time.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
we got some breaking news.
Oh, what's happening?
Sam Cassell has agreed to join the Boston Celtics coaching staff under Joe
Ooh.
Mazzulla.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. And we're going to get to this because most of Boston's coaching staff, headlined by Ben Sullivan, is joining Ime Udoka in Houston.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that. I got a lot to say about that.
But one thing I want to note, this is actually really interesting because that's a lateral move. I've heard that Sam Cassell and James Harden are very close. That is very, very interesting to me.
That he left Philly.
Yeah, for a lateral move. Now, it's a lateral move. Now, maybe they're offering him more money. Also, well, I guess I shouldn't say lateral because Doc Rivers is out. So it wasn't a given that Nick Nurse would retain him. However, it's another piece of evidence. It's one of those things, just as when they hired Nurse, point out, yeah, they could have gone all in on James and said, hey, we're hiring your coach with Mike D'Antoni, and they hired Nick Nurse. So I don't think it's necessarily anti-Harden, but it's not, a super pro Harden hire. They could have gone out of their way to retain Sam Cassell, and they didn't do that. So that's interesting.
So there's a few things. He signed with Boston, and I don't even know if he was in conversations with Houston, but the fact that he didn't come to Houston is, I mean, it's not even a deal. It's not only is it not a big deal, it's not even a deal, but it's just a thought that crossed my mind. The second thing is it makes sense from a career path perspective because I think Joe Mazzulla was kind of on the hot seat. Not on the hot seat, but he's not the guy with the most job security in the world right now. So there may be a pathway there to Sam Cassell finally getting his first head coach opportunity. I don't know how the money lines up, but I think just from a career perspective, that makes sense. But it is interesting that he is leaving Philly, and especially because, I mean, Philly just hired Nick Nurse. He's not going to be in the hot seat for a while. And especially because I'm sure he's one of the highest paid head coaches, as opposed to Mazzulla, who I don't think will be.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at, like a Nate McMillan, Lloyd Pierce type dynamic, to where Mazzulla gets forced out and Cassell has a cleaner path to the head job in Boston too. Yeah,
exactly.
But I think that's actually a good segue. I did want to talk about the Udoka vision comments, but we can table that since we're on assistants now. Look, we've heard the Rockets linked to a number of Boston assistants, and now that the Celtics season is over, they can actually close deals with some of these guys. And the way it typically works is there's no formal announcement until the entire staff is set. But it looks like they have deals with Garrett Jackson, Mike Moser, Aaron Miles has been mentioned as a strong possibility, and most notably, Ben Sullivan. Look, I still think the Rockets want a big name lead assistant. We know they were in the market for James Borrego, right?
Yep, and he since then signed as the lead assistant
with New Orleans, and that may be the similar dynamic because obviously Udoka has a ton of job security in Houston. Whereas the Pelicans, that's a situation similar to Boston, where with high expectations and a team that's underachieved a bit in recent years relative to those expectations, there's absolutely a world in which the head coach could get fired, and then all of a sudden there's an easy internal promotion that may have been a factor there as well, similar to Cassell and the Celtics, because if you're not getting a head job, then maybe you want to go to somewhere that gives you a clean path to be the internal replacement if somebody with high expectations makes a move during the season. So that could be a factor there as well. He will not be the guy in Houston, but I still think it's telling that the Rockets were after him at all. And perhaps there are some other big names that Udoka could go after in the near future to sort of be that lead assistant. But I do think that the guys he's poaching from Boston, it's interesting on a few levels. First off, it speaks well to ownership that the Rockets are willing to pay because Boston is a really good team. And so to leave a good team in a good market for a team that's been one of the worst the last couple of years, Tillman Fertitta is having to invest. These hires are not coming cheaply. And so these guys clearly believe in Udoka, even after a year with Missoula, in which the Celtics, it was a disappointing loss in Game 7 of the conference finals, but still a very strong season. So it shows, again, a real belief in what Udoka was building, and of course a willingness to spend on the part of Tillman Fertitta and ownership of the Rockets. But beyond that, look, they're finalizing this staff. I could not be more pleased with investment in a shooting coach like Ben Sullivan, who most recently has worked with Derek White, who's really taken a big jump the last couple of years. But going back to his Milwaukee days, and that was where he worked with Giannis to improve him to a more passable level on the perimeter. Ben Sullivan is one of those guys that's looked at around the NBA as a shooting guru. And that's something the Rockets the last couple of years just have not have. John Lucas has tried his best, but I don't think anyone is calling John Lucas a shot doctor. This is an actual shooting guru, Ben Sullivan, and that is so important for this young team where there are so many questions that come down to simply, can these guys shoot at a high enough clip to be viable? Tari in the threes. Can Jabari Smith Jr. get back to the elite shooting guy he was projected to be out of Auburn? Can Alperen Sengun get to a passable level from three-point range? You go up and down the roster. Other than Kevin Porter Jr., everyone has questions about shooting to some degree. For the Rockets to invest in that position, again, I'm not saying the staff is set. I do suspect that based on the rumored Borrego interest that they'll look into adding perhaps one more big name if one comes available. But to actually get a shooting guru on staff, which they haven't really had the last couple of years, to me, that's one of the most important pieces that a young rebuilding team can have, especially because, Oklahoma City brought in, what's the name of the OKC guy that they brought in last summer?
Chip England.
Oh, yeah, Chip, yeah. And that paid immediate dividends. Didn't they have several guys that took a decent jump this year?
I think Giddy was one of them. I think the
Yeah.
point guard that was supposed to be a sharpshooter that came from not Trey Jones. I think it's not Trey Jones, but
Yeah.
it's I confuse. There's two small point guards from the same draft in the second round that I always confused. One of them is the one that's on the Spurs, and the second one is the one that went to the Thunder. I can look it
But
up
anyway,
real quick.
the larger point, though, look, the assistants hired to date or rumored to be hired, again, none of these announcements are official. They check a lot of boxes. I think clearly they had to believe in what Ime Udoka is building. They had to be impressed by the commitment from Rafael Stone to build a contending roster. They had to be paid enough money by Tillman Fertitta. And in this case, to bring in a guy with shooting expertise, it shows you that they get it. So while I'm not going to say it's the greatest coaching staff ever, to me, these are all pretty promising signs that they get it when it comes to sort of the vision for how to maximize the development of this young core moving forward, and perhaps a way that they haven't under Stephen Silas the last couple of years.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think Ben Sullivan is obviously the great get. I was actually talking to someone who worked with Boston and their summer league team when Udoka was there, and they just had a raving review about Sullivan, not only as a shooting coach, but just as a basketball mind. They actually thought that Sullivan would be the one to get the head coaching job when Udoka left, when the news first broke out. To me, I think that's a pretty big endorsement. Just a great basketball mind and commands respect. They also had something to say about the assistant coach that is not confirmed or is not, there's been some differing reports when it comes to Aaron Miles, Mike Moser, and the other guy that I'm forgetting right now that also comes from the Celtics. Yeah, exactly.
Garrett Jackson, and he goes back to the Spurs with Udoka. He's a video guy.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think currently, according to the latest reports, I think Mike Moser, Ben Sullivan, and Garrett Jackson are the ones that are confirmed. Aaron Miles is currently, I think, a question mark. But about Aaron Miles, he's supposedly like he's Tatum's guy. He was a point guard in college. He had a career there. He's more of a player development guy. So who knows what's going to happen with that? But other than that, I think Royal Ivy is going to be more of a defensive minded guy. I
Good
think
point. I
that's a,
forgot about Ivy. Yeah, and tidbit, I've heard that players around the league love Royal Ivy.
Well, that's good to
And
know. He was previously with Brooklyn. I'm
with
not gonna.
Brooklyn, yeah, and obviously James Harden was on that team with Ivy and Udoka during that 2020 to 2021 year. There's also some other targets from Brooklyn that the Rockets could go after either in free agency or, room exception. We talked about Seth Curry types. That's, of course, on top of the obvious guys when you look at their roster in sort of an unstable situation. So, yeah, the Brooklyn connection definitely can't hurt.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think he's going to be more of a defensive guy. I think.
And that was the
I'm
way
not,
he played, too. Yeah.
I'm not gonna say he was the defensive guy in Brooklyn. He might have been one of them. I think the defensive guy was actually Jack Vaughn, who is currently the head coach. But then other than that, there was a report by Sports Illustrated. The Houston guy. I always forget his name.
Cody
No,
Davis.
no, no disrespect. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Cody
I'm sorry for
Davis.
forgetting the
Yeah.
name. He
By the way, one more
reported.
Ivy tidbit. Bruce Brown, who's a free agent this summer, currently playing for the Nuggets in the NBA Finals, that's someone the Rockets could go after, has gone out of his way in multiple interviews that I've read to praise Ivy and the work that he did to sort of elevate his game during those years he was with the Nets. So I want to throw in Bruce Brown into the mix as well, as far as guys with Brooklyn connections that Ivy could be perhaps a bit of a factor for. Sorry for interrupting. Cody Davis.
You're all good. That's music to my ears because I love the possibility of Bruce Brown coming to the Rockets, and he's a perfect type of player. I think KJ Martin is not going to be here for long, and I think Bruce Brown fills that role a lot better. He's just a better perimeter defender. The shooting, I think, is comparable, although Bruce Brown is a better shooter this year. But then again, low sample size, so who knows? But I think he has the same instincts of cutting off ball and repositioning and just being a connector that KJ Martin also has that IQ. That being said, I wanted to get to the report by Cody Davis that John Lucas and Mahmoud Abdel Fattah are still in the running to stay with the Rockets as assistant coaches. And now that James Borrego is no longer an option, I could see Abdel Fattah being more of the offensive coach. I think he did a great job offensively with namely guards in the league. The guys that we sent there did a great job with Bishop Nix while he was there the first time around. He did a great job with Josh Christopher, the small stint he was there. I don't know if you guys don't remember. Josh Christopher was struggling with the main team. He went down for a week or two. He killed it there, and he came back, and he looked like a completely different player. Kevin Porter Jr. looked like a god in summer league as well. So I would be excited about that as an offensive coach if he was dependent on whether Borrego came or not.
Yeah. And by the way, maybe John Lucas ends up being your big name veteran now that there's no Borrego. If there's no big external splash to be the lead assistant, perhaps Lucas, who we know has a rapport with the players and gets the best out of them from a culture standpoint. There were some questions about just how good he is in terms of his shooting work. Maybe Lucas makes more sense now that you wouldn't be relying on him nearly as much for the shooting component now that you have Ben Sullivan.
Yeah, and the last point I want to make about it, without mentioning any names, I mean, I think it's a pretty big indictment on what Tillman Fertitta is willing to spend. That not only did we get Ime Udoka, one of the top targets on the market, even though he didn't get a Monty Williams level contract. I mean, thank God for that, because
Yeah, well,
not
that's
that
from
I
sheer
get.
desperation. That's an outlier. That's the Rudy Gobert of coaching hires from the standpoint of it just completely being disproportionate with value and perhaps thrown off the entire market. Yeah, the Rockets paid a pretty penny for Udoka, even if it's not in the ballpark of Monty. That's just an outlier desperation hire.
Yeah, and so this to say that Ime Udoka had a pretty large coaching staff with Boston, and right now we're looking at Royal Ivy, Ben Sullivan, Mike Moser, Garrett Jackson. It's kind of confirmed names. That's 4. We're
Yeah,
looking at Aaron Miles as a possibility. That's 5. John Lucas and Abdel Fattah, if they stay, that's 7
yeah,
assistant coaches.
yeah.
That's a long bench.
Yeah, you may have, and of course, yeah, you used a full 2 rows. I mean, I think somebody pointed out that the staff in Boston had 10 or 11 guys on it. So yeah, there may be even more, and that does speak on some level to a willingness to actually invest and pay those guys too.
Yeah, and then this not only to talk about Tillman being willing to spend that money, also that the guy that I was talking to that was with Boston for the summer league a couple of years ago also talked about, or was talking to me about, people really underrate the impact of assistant coaches when it comes to
Agreed.
day-to-day operations and the individual
Agree.
player development, because the head coach is in charge of rotations, in charge of more big picture stuff. But the guy and they do have singular interactions with players when they feel it's necessary and when they see something. It's more of a, they're taking care of the global thing, and if they notice something specific, they'll go address it. But assistant coaches are the guys that are with the players, they like day to day, that are doing the drills with them, that are working on their development with them. Uh, the small stuff. Right,
And
and that's key. And
yeah,
having a really good coaching assistant, like coaching staff beyond your head coach, I think it's a
yeah,
huge deal. And I was really jealous of the Thunder when they got Chip England last year. And I since then pulled up the stats. I mean, Isaiah Joe was shooting 41% from 3 on 5 attempts. Jalen Williams was mostly non-shooter in college, 40%. Darius basically up to 40%. Aaron Wiggins, who is fined by them, up to 39%. Pokusevski is up to
yeah,
37%. I mean, that's just across the roster, other than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but that's really a volatile number because he's not really a guy that's going to shoot volume threes, at least in his most efficient form.
yeah.
But Josh Giddey in specific made a huge jump. And so Ben Sullivan is someone that I'm really excited about. And the other guys as well. I mean, I think coaching staff is something that you don't have a
Oh
salary
yeah,
cap on, and so you should invest
it's a
as much as
competitive
you possibly
advantage.
can. Yeah,
Yeah,
you can't have too many assistant
and it
coaches.
yeah, and it ties in well with one of Rafael's other comments. I should mention that all of these comments that we're reacting to, you go to the logger line on Twitter, and I've retweeted them. We're focusing largely on the Rafael ones because, again, he was sort of under asked for obvious reasons at the previous availability. And of course, he's also the guy in charge of talking about really the offseason strategy when we talk about the draft and free agency and this critical time period. But he also talked in a different answer about the importance of watching the 2023 playoffs and learning from it, which Kevin Porter Jr. and Jabari Smith Jr. said they were. Obviously, they talked about the little things they're trying to develop as far as players. Jabari's doing yoga, boxing, trying to get more flexible, working on his ball handling. Kevin Porter Jr. wants to get back to where he was as a rookie with finishing. Those are just the little day-to-day things that we should be expecting from players. But Rafael also talks about philosophically watching these teams and saying that, look, the game is changing, it's evolving. Some of these things I see in the playoffs, including just how hard you have to play, are things we need to be all about starting game one next year. I mean, you look at the two teams in the NBA Finals, the Nuggets and the Heat, I mean, they're different stories in terms of takeaways for the Rockets philosophically. Denver, I think certainly you can make an argument for how they have developed Nikola Jokic. There's some similarities with what the Rockets might can do with Sengun. That comparison's been thrown out ad nauseum. But the other part, and this ties in with the assistants and the overall coaching staff, look at the Heat and culture. I know people are sick of hearing it, but Heat culture is real. How hard they play on a day-to-day basis is a competitive environment, especially when it gets to the playoffs and they can really sort of unload the clip every single time and just play 100% and leave it all on the floor. The fact that the Heat are just so disciplined and don't have those lapses, that gives them a competitive advantage, even in situations where their talent isn't as good. And so, of course, Erik Spoelstra has cultivated that overall culture, and that's the role of a head coach like Udoka in Houston. But there's a whole staff of assistants, including, Chris Quinn has gotten a ton of hype this offseason. He's gotten a number of interviews as someone that's really shown a lot of promise. And it's the assistants like Chris Quinn with the Heat who talk to these players on a day-to-day basis, besides just the X's and O's and the technique. They keep the players bought in. The head coach is the guy who does the big picture things, but it's the assistant coaches who do much more of the day-to-day. And that's very important in creating that type of special culture, which, as we've seen with the Heat, that type of culture can be a huge competitive advantage, even in situations where your talent might be a little bit lacking.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of the parallels and what Rafael Stone mentioned about what to learn from the two teams that are in the finals, I think a lot of people took that and said, "Oh, we're going to buy into Sengun because he's like Jokic," and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the first takeaway that I get from these playoffs is that, listen, in the years that I followed the NBA, I've never seen as many teams that are talented and should have a possibility of winning and sometimes are favorites. I've never seen teams give up as much as I've seen this year. I think it's not now that the league's so talented that it's not just about getting the best talent. It's about motivating that talent so that they don't completely fall apart at the smallest adversity. I think what you can one of the things that you can take away from the Heat is that up until the finals, and even in the first game of the finals, the second game's happening as we speak, they have not lost a single game by more than 10 points, other than the one loss they had in the first round series against the Bucks in game 2. I think that's insane. And I think that really, in comparison to other teams, is really eye-opening because the Heat just don't get blown out. They don't have the best offense. They play a really greedy, hard-forced type of offense. It's defensively the same thing. But one thing that you don't see is they're really hard to. They're like an annoying little team that you just can't put away. And I think that's huge moving forward in the mentality that you want your players to have, because we saw this. I mean, the Sixers quit. Let's be honest. The Sixers, Game 7, they quit. It wasn't going their way. Games started slipping away, and they never came back. The Celtics, I mean, that series was almost over in 4, and by some miracle, they won game 4, and then Jimmy Butler struggled for a couple of games. They had Gabe Vincent get injured, and they managed to claw it back all the way to 7. But then in Game 7, it wasn't close. Like, teams start slipping away and they give up. The Suns, the same thing. I mean, they went out shooting because KD and Devin Booker were, trying to play against 2 versus 5, but it reached the point where they just couldn't hang on to the game. The Kings themselves, they managed to the Warriors got to 7, right? But in Game 7, the Kings let the game slip away, and it wasn't close on the stretch. I think a big take from the Heat is that nowadays, nearly all of the teams are really talented, the ones that make it to the playoffs. And you can make the argument that the Celtics were much more talented than the Heat, and I mean, in my opinion, they were even much more talented than the Sixers.
Agree.
But when it comes down to it, we're at a point where both teams in any spot in the playoffs are going to be really talented and talented enough that if one side's talent is elevated, they can put up a fight and they can even sweep a series. And so, even though you might be the more talented team by a lot, you still need to be on top of your game because it's really easy to get upset. And that goes to show parity and everything. But that was my first takeaway. And I think Ime Udoka is someone that can help us in that regard moving forward. And then when we talk about the Nuggets, to me, with the Nuggets, it's more of a team building philosophy thing. When it comes to the Sengun stuff, and I'm going to come across as maybe a little bit of a hater, but I mean, it kind of helps the argument for Sengun, but then it's the same thing as, okay, Sengun and Jokic are kind of the same archetype, but Jokic is like the top 0.1% of their archetype.
Yeah.
And when you're an all-time great, then archetypes don't matter, right? At that point, it doesn't matter. And you can equate that to any archetype. I mean, if you have, let's look at the most ridiculous example of this. If you have a Davis Bertans type, just a pure sharpshooter, right? If this guy was a sharpshooter, but was an all-time great version of it, like this guy shoots, I don't know, 60% from 3 on 15 attempts a game. But at that point, man, I mean, you can live with whatever defense he's bringing to the table because, I mean, this guy is like an all-time great shooter, and he's the 0.1% top of the archetype. I don't think Jokic having success, and all the props to him because he is an all-time great, and what he's doing is absolutely nuts, helps or hurts Sengun's case long-term. Because, I mean, if your argument is that if Sengun can reach Jokic levels, then it works. I mean, I could have given that to you before the playoffs started. It's not really a hot take. I mean, if Sengun can become a 0.1% all-time great version of his archetype, sure, I mean, the more credit to him, but that's not any more likely than Jalen Green becoming the 0.1% of his archetype and becoming Michael Jordan
Right.
or Kobe Bryant,
Right.
or Jabari Smith Jr. hitting the 0.1% of his archetype and becoming Kevin Durant, or something like that, or Usman Garuba hitting the 0.1% of his archetype and becoming, I don't know, Chris Bosh or something like that. Right. So from a Sengun argument perspective, I don't really see the kind of the connection there, but I do think that there's some takeaways to take from the Nuggets team building strategy that I want to touch on. There's getting role players, right? And something that I've learned to value more is that being a 3-and-D wing might not be enough. And in specific, for the Nuggets case, what helps them so much and what makes them so unguardable is that their 3-and-D wings are not Robert Covington types, where really good defender, really high IQ defensively, but offensively, Robert Covington, if you give him 15 shots, 15 open 3-pointers, and he's shooting 25%, he's going to take the 16th and the 17th and the 18th shot, even though he's clearly not making them, and that's going to shoot you out of games sometimes. The difference with the Nuggets is that the role players that they went and got, Aaron Gordon, Bruce Brown, even KCP, we saw that on full display against the Rockets. Even Michael Porter Jr., I mean, he's not really a role player. He's reaching that star level, but the main role players that they got, the ones that play the most minutes, are not just very, I'm not going to call them cheap versions or they're not very strict versions of their archetypes as far as a 3-and-D role player. Part of the reason why the Nuggets offense works so much is that if you replace Aaron Gordon with Robert Covington, there will be a game a series or 2 games a series, or you're introducing a lot of variance to games where you sag off Robert Covington and he's going to settle for that 3 every single time, if open or not. And some of those games he's not going to have it, and he's going to miss 10 threes. So it's called 10 threes and shoot you out of a game. And you have a chance at the other team. Even though the Nuggets have an all-time great offense, if you find a failure in the system, then you're going to lose games, and that gives you more chances of losing games. Another example of a role player that's versatile, Jeff Green, I would say so as well. The problem is we can't really sag off of Aaron Gordon, and hope that he falls into the fallacy of shooting a lot of threes and being cold one night, is because he's a smarter player than that. He's not going to settle every single time. He's going to attack the closeout, and he has the IQ and the passing to, once he gets to the rim, it's not like he's going to make the right read if help defense comes. And Bruce Brown is another example of this. These are all guys that although are 3-and-D wings, they have that, in our class people call it like the plus, where they have a little bit of playmaking, and they have decision making to adapt on the fly and make the correct reads off of the advantages that Nikola Jokic is going to create. And then at the same time, they have this weird tandem where, since Jokic is at the 5 as the engine, and he's also such a gifted scorer as well as passer, if you stick your best big man defender on Jokic, then you have no one to help or to be an effective helper like elsewhere. Otherwise, the ball's going to find its way back to Jokic, and he's going to score because he has some different type of switch. So I think their roster was so well built, and they found the perfect players with that extra, IQ and playmaking to make them just as unguardable as they look against the Heat. And I don't know how the game is going right now, but as they've looked all playoffs, and even with the Lakers, who had AD, one of the best big man defenders in the league, it doesn't matter because there's no one very specific thing that you can target to get an advantage, because all of these guys are smart with the decisions they make with the ball. There's no Daniel House in there that's gonna force a dunk or force a step back 3, or people always say, if you have an open shot, shoot it and keep shooting it. Well, that's only true if you extend the sample size to something much larger, where eventually it's going to even out. In something as small as a playoff series that can be over in 4 games, just keep shooting, as we saw with the Rockets when they went over 27, although with all the caveats with refereeing. In such a sample size, it is very much possible that you just keep shooting. You don't get the reversion to the mean that you're expecting when coaches say just keep shooting if you're up. And so having players that are able to do something, and this is my takeaway and something that I've learned because I used to favor lower cost, just 3D guys versus paying the premium that an Aaron Gordon is going to cost to get the playmaking and the IQ that comes with it. I think that's the big takeaway, and it's a big reason why I really like Bruce Brown for the Rockets moving forward.
I think a way to tie all this together and put a bow on it, we got sidetracked a little bit in our earlier discussion about Rafael and Ime's comments on Friday because there was the breaking news about Cassell going from the Sixers to the Nets as an assistant. So we talked more about the assistants and overall coaching philosophies. But look, when we talk about the Nuggets and the Heat, two things that really stand out to me. Certainly there's the talent, but it's also organizational alignment. We talked about in the context of Miami, the Heat culture. I think from top to bottom of the organizations, from ownership to the front office to the coaching staff, these are two teams that are not built solely on superstars. Nikola Jokic is the best player in the league. Let's not go crazy about that. But there is very much a coherent organizational philosophy from the top on down that maximizes those two teams. Everyone is moving, all the ducks are moving in the same row. And this is not a situation where it's just the overall talent overcoming other deficiencies. These are very much successful systems. And so that ties back into the quote that Rafael said about Ime's vision. And you touched on this earlier, but I want to underscore just how important this is and also add a little bit of context. There were some people wondering if it might tie into the James Harden pursuit of lack of one. The comment from Rafael: we need to understand his vision. We need a lot of help from Ime in terms of the direction he wants this team to go. Then it's on us to do the work to get the right guy to fit that. It doesn't make any sense to go get a great player whose strengths lay in a style of basketball that Ime doesn't particularly want to play. We're spending a lot of time together to make sure we're completely on the same page. I'm just trying to understand how we're going to play and how he envisions the growth moving forward. That's on both of us to make sure we're on the same page. Again, if you want to see those full interviews, just go to the Logger Line on Twitter. I retweeted all of those videos. You should be able to find them pretty easily. Look, some people wondered about James Harden's style of play and ball dominance. It's possible, but I would also say that with Ime Udoka, we're still sort of learning. I thought one of his really good interviews, I forget if it was the Jonathan Fagan one with the Chronicle or Kelly Eco of The Athletic, but one of his interviews, he talked about, he comes from the Greg Popovich tree in San Antonio, and everybody talks about the beautiful game and how much they moved the ball during the early 2010s and that championship run in 2014, which was legendary. But some of that, as Ime pointed out, was simply personnel. The Spurs at that point didn't really have a guy whose advantage was going out and getting buckets in one-on-one situations. Kawhi Leonard was on the roster, but Kawhi had not broken out to superstar status or anything close to it in 2014. So they played that way because it maximized the group that they had. In Boston, it was a veteran core that played differently. And of course, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are able to get those types of tough buckets that some of the Spurs guys weren't. So they played a different style. And so I think with Ime, we're still sort of learning. His sample as a head coach is relatively small. So in terms of what is Ime Udoka ball, he's talked about some principles, but he's also talked about adapting it to the personnel. And Rafael said in his other answer that we talked about earlier, best player available. So it's a combination. It's not just a rigid X's and O's style. It's marrying that to your personnel. You want to have certainly championship level talent. And again, beyond all of those factors, we're still learning about Ime as well. It's not as if his sample as a head coach is that long. So I would say, just as an overall sort of cautionary tale, keep in mind that, it's not like the Rockets hired someone who has a set system with 20 years of experience running it, like, say, Mike D'Antoni. And even D'Antoni modified his system a bit to sort of muck it up and go more isolation heavy because it worked out a lot better in terms of how those matchups would play against the Warriors in 2018 and 2019. Even D'Antoni, who was very rigid with the system, adapted it some. So again, I wouldn't necessarily say that we know 100% what Ime's system is and exactly how this is going to play. There's more flexibility than I think some people think. The other part of it, look, Ime has a relationship with James Harden. Perhaps he wants James based on that experience together in Brooklyn. It's worth noting that that first year was when James was really on his best behavior. That was before things started going sideways with regards to Kyrie and the vaccine and everything that went on with Steve Nash first coming under question with his job security in 2022, which is the year that at the deadline, Harden forced his way out to Philly. That was not when Udoka was there. Udoka was there the previous year when things went very well, and they were probably, a shoe size from winning the championship. If Kevin Durant's shoe is one size smaller, he's behind the line with that last second shot against the Bucks. And in my opinion, those were clearly the two best teams. And in that case, the Nets probably win the title if that shot is a 3 instead of a 2, and they win the game right there instead of going on to overtime where they lose. And at that point, that's a championship team. And we've heard recently Bruce Brown, who you just mentioned, Paolo, went out of his way in one of the interviews before the finals to talk about what a great leader that Harden was with that team and really a tone setter. Again, I would not necessarily say that, well, because Harden's ball dominant, that quote means that he's not going to be a fit here. No, there's also an argument you can make that Udoka saw Harden at his best as both a player and especially as a leader, as someone that helped develop a lot of the younger guys, including Bruce Brown. So my point, it's not necessarily to endorse signing him based on that. It's just to show that and to illustrate that you can make arguments in both directions. I think the larger point that Rafael was trying to get at with those comments is that this is not going to be like the Stephen Silas years where there's a lack of alignment. They know now that to maximize this group, they need to be on the same page. They trust this coach. Again, that's part of why the Rockets went out and paid big money for a proven head coach like Ime Udoka. It's someone that they believe they can trust to handle the day-to-day along with those assistants, the developing of that young core and implementing the right systems and processes and culture and so on and so forth. I think the larger point that Rafael was trying to get at, and I've heard this privately as well, whether they do or don't pursue Harden, it's going to be a decision that is not made by one singular entity. It won't be made just by Rafael Stone. It won't be made just by ownership. It won't be made just by the head coach. It will be a combination of everyone. They will take everyone's input into consideration. And so in this case, again, they are willing to trust the head coach. They are willing to be deferential. And I do think that's a change from the last couple of years. I think that's led to some of the cultural issues and some of the questions about the alignment that were completely valid the last couple of years. And it was becoming obvious that Stephen Silas wasn't going to be the long-term guy for this team. To me, it was less about Harden individually and more about just a broader statement that, look, Ime is going to be a part of this process. We realize that alignment is a big part of what makes teams like the Nuggets and Heat where they are. And we're going to involve him in this process, and we're not going to do anything that goes against what he believes in. And so I just think that it was meant less about any one individual situation, Harden or otherwise, and more just a general statement about how, look, going forward, the head coach is going to be a part of these discussions. And in my opinion, he should be, right?
Yeah, I think so. So I think you hit it on the head when you said that part of what makes the Heat culture is the fact that Spoelstra is one of the best coaches in the NBA, of course, but he's been there for a while. Same thing with the Nuggets. I think nowadays more and more coaches get fired really quickly, and I think that culture that you're talking about and that everyone wants to build is something that comes from just not giving up on a guy at the first stumble, right? I think it's big that, I mean, Udoka is not going to be 100% successful at every stage. I think it's important to have patience and at the first stumble, not demand that he's fired, to not put pressure on the team for him to be fired. I think that's what's going to happen, especially because of the timing in our rebuild that he comes in at. There's going to be some level of flexibility and some level of leeway given to him early on, because this is a rebuilding team, and then a 10 win improvement would be a really good improvement. And then if it's a 20 win improvement in 2 years, that's going to be a really big improvement as well. If you make the play-in, that's a big improvement. If you make the playoffs, even more so. And so there are a few years where he gets to come in and set the culture and set the standards that he wants to uphold. Before we're actually in the fire of the playoffs, in the okay, now this is do or die, and this is when coaches like Doc Rivers and Monty Williams and all of these guys, after these teams go all in, the window is so short that teams don't really can't really afford to trust head coaches to work through more than 1 or 2 years of failing, because when you're all in, guys are aging. You don't really have the assets to really build a team further. So since Rockets are in an earlier stage and he gets 2-3 years, I would say, to really set his system and to set his standards and to build that culture, that when we actually get to a point where the Heat are now, where you're trying to actually win, you've had pieces that have been here a long time that can uphold that culture, and hopefully we can get to a point where Rockets culture is a thing. That being said, the other thing that I would mention is it's pretty telling that the names that the Rockets are supposed to be tied with when it comes to free agents, Cam Johnson, Bruce Brown, Robert Lopez. What are some other names?
Or Brooke Lopez, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, Brook Lopez. There's one more name that I'm forgetting. Even Dylan Brooks to some extent. These are guys that are plug and play into any system and that can adapt
Yeah, you can play
to
different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things that we saw with Udoka is that I think there's a couple of principles, which is switchability, and which is defensive acumen and then floor spacing. And within that, which is a lot of what the Celtics have, within that, he then made adjustments, especially on the defensive scheme when they went with Robert Williams as the free safety, the roaming big. He can make the adjustments when the pieces are versatile enough for him to make those adjustments. And I think it signals alignment with him and his philosophy from what we've seen so far, that most of the names that we are hearing are those versatile names. We are not hearing Fred VanVleet, who is an undersized guard that's, good at defense now, but he's not exactly just a plug and play guy. Guys like, Derrick Rose, another guy like that. He's a free agent. Nikola Vucevic is another guy that's not going to be plug and play. Yes, some of these guys coincide with roles that we already have filled, right? But I think it's interesting that we haven't been tied to guys like that. Even Draymond Green, who is really versatile defender offensively, that's just one. I think there's just one system he can play. He can he can space the floor. He's not a role man. He can. And he's a screener, right, on offense mostly, and he's going to be a short roll passer, and he's going to be, run all of those dribble handoffs. That's the only style he can play. And not trying to take a dig at Draymond Green. I think he's an all-time great, but I don't think he is an all-time great if he starts off in any other team other than the Warriors.
Oh, I would agree with that.
And so we are not tied to a name like that so far, although there's the crazy rumor that the Rockets followed him on Twitter, so that must mean something as it. Whatever. Christian Wood. Another guy like that that's going to be has a clear hole in his game. Rockets are not tied to him. So a lot of the overarching point is that the names we're tied to. This is something that makes me happy because the last thing you want to do is tie a lot of money into a guy that's not going to, while you don't have an identity, that's not going to fit into what your possible identity might be. Most of the guys that we are linked to are guys that fit into any system, and for a team lacking an identity, that's really good. And I think that it also signals that it is in alignment with what Ime Udoka is thinking.
And then with Harden, a big part of it just comes down to what we've said before about the overall value. It's not just about the X's and O's of how he fits in. It's also about, look, it's an opportunity to get a guy of that stature that typically isn't there for a rebuilding group at this stage. And so part of the equation with Harden, and this goes back into what Ime said in his interview about, adapting to your personnel, it's just an overall value advantage. Even if Harden isn't, plug and play, obviously Harden has a certain way that he plays. At the same point, you also have to be adaptable to the overall system. And so if adding a player of a certain talent is clearly for the betterment of your overall group, then it makes sense to tweak your system to account for that. And so to me, it's just like Harden, I guess the way I would sum it up, to put a bow on it, Harden is so overwhelming in terms of his talent relative to what you have now, that's someone you would say, hey, I'm just going to adjust my scheme to fit the talent. Whereas the other guys that aren't at that level, they need to be more plug and play, right?
Yeah, and not only that, not only is the talent cap so much bigger compared to other free agents, it's also that he fits a need we don't have currently, and we don't know how the draft's going to go, which is why I'm kind of sold or not on the James Harden return. We don't have a guy to play the role that James Harden is going to play when he comes here. And with the Celtics, Ime Udoka had to shoehorn a guy that doesn't really play that role into that role in Marcus Smart. And then the year later, they went and tried to get and got Malcolm Brogdon, who not really a true point guard, but it's close, and you can kind of play him in a playmaking by committee type of thing. It's the combination of he's so much better than all the alternatives.
Yeah.
With he's not going to get in the way of anybody, and he's going to help enhance the rest of the guys, because Jalen Green should be playing a lot more off ball than he was, and he expressed that he wanted more structure. Jabari Smith, at this stage in his career, but he is an off ball player for the most part. He's not really capable of creating by himself just yet. And even Alperen Sengun, I think a lot of people say he's not a great fit with James, but when you look at what James was doing in Philly, a lot of it, doesn't have the burst coming out of the pick and roll to play with a rim running big as at least as reliably as he used to. A lot of their pick and roll was Embiid setting the screen and being so much of a threat that all James Harden had to do was pass to him on the short roll and let him make a decision whether it was to score or to kick out. And Alperen Sengun is going to fit perfectly into that role, and we're not going to we're not going to need, if James Harden comes back, of course, we're not going to need to do as much of the over the top post pass, because if you have Alperen Sengun setting the screen, that's a really easy way to get him inside with the ball and let him use all of his talents, creating advantages there. So I actually don't really think defensively, of course, Sengun and Harden is not going to be great, but then Sengun and Jalen Green is also not going to be great defensively. So I think offensively they really fit together really
Yep.
well.
Yep. And the last thing I'll say as we wind down, there is some penalty in terms of trust to lying in these types of settings. So we spent the last hour and nearly hour and a half talking about these interviews that Rafael and Ime gave. Look, while not everything is going to be 100% truth serum, look, these guys aren't going to bold-faced lie, because if that's the case, then look, the media is not going to be as trusting of you and the fan base won't in the future. And so there are consequences to that. And so, again, it's not meant to say that everything is 100% truth, but they are trying to offer some transparency. I mean, certainly it makes sense for the reasons we've been outlining, but also they're incentivized to do it. And so it's important to keep in mind that it's not like we're just blindly making the assumption that these things, well, that must be the case just because the Rockets are saying them. No, they're saying them and they make sense. And, a place to sort of tie it all together, Ime Udoka, in one of his comments, he talked about wanting to pursue the Boston assistants, but not being able to do it prior to last week, of course, because the Celtics were still in the playoffs. Well, he made those comments, Friday at the community event, and he also met with the media briefly Thursday at Minute Maid Park when he threw out the first pitch at the Astros-Angels game, the ceremonial one. Then on Saturday, according to Mike Scotto of Hoops Hype, the Rockets had the deal with at least the first three of Ben Sullivan, Garrett Jackson, and Mike Moser. We'll see what happens with Aaron Miles, who they're rumored to be interested in as well. I don't think that one, at least according to Scotto, is quite done just yet. But the point is, Udoka said it in his media, and then within a day or two, it actually happened. And that deal did get to the finish line. So again, there's certainly alignment. Tillman and ownership were willing to pay what it costs to get those guys out of a good situation in Boston. One of the Celtics beat writers in The Athletic made that point last week, that they weren't going to come cheaply, especially to a bad team like Houston. They would need some sort of upgrade financially and role or both. Well, the Rockets made it happen. But beyond that, I think it gives credence to the fact that, look, they are trying to be transparent. Ime Udoka told us in those interviews that's what they were trying to do. And the next day, it actually got done. So if you want to believe, besides just the obvious that, look, it's what they're saying, it sounds good, but if you're questioning, well, is this really the truth behind closed doors? Look, we've got some evidence. The move on the Celtics assistants, that's exactly what Ime said. So hopefully if you buy that was the truth, and clearly it was, then these other things we've been talking about, hopefully those play out along similar lines as well, because at least in terms of philosophically and what the Rockets are trying to build and do with this all important offseason, again, I thought the answers from Rafael and Ime were very strong. It feels like they have a good control on what they want to do, and it should be a very fun month ahead as they try to actually accomplish it and get it done with the draft and free agency. Anyway, with that, we'll finally wrap up. Again, we'll have more shows in the near future breaking down some specific targets with both the draft and free agency. We'll also have some guests. Wanted to do this one a bit differently because, again, we don't have that many actual opportunities to speak to the Rockets in the offseason since there aren't games, there aren't any official availabilities. Felt like we should do a show just based on what they said and talk a bit more big picture philosophy as it pertains to team building, what they're trying to do. And I guess in this case, talking more about the macro of the 2023 offseason and where it fits in the rebuild. We'll get back into the micro in terms of specific targets, who they draft, who they sign in free agency. We'll do that more in the coming days and weeks. Anyway, with that, we will adjourn. For Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. If you want more from us before our next episode, the best place to get it is on Twitter. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. And this show, The Logger Line, is on there simply at The Logger Line. If you go there, you can find our link tree, and that's got links to all of our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify, and also links to our friends and partners over at Carback Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets, where you can access their content as well. Just hit up the links that are available through the link tree at the Logger Line. Also, if you go to Logger Line on Twitter, twitter.com/the Logger Line, if you're not an active user, you can find the videos of Rafael Stone making the comments that we've been discussing over the last 80 to 90 minutes if you want to hear them for yourself. All right, with those plugs complete, we'll wrap up. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of the Logger Line.